Good evening to those bored enough to watch. In the previous video, I discussed Five Nights at Freddy's 3 and how it introduced change into the series in a masterful and interesting way, in which kept the core mechanics and foundation of the previous two while ultimately becoming something of its own. That game also took a different approach to storytelling, remaining equally as cryptic while simultaneously masterfully telling the tale of the purple guy and how destroying the animatronics ultimately caught up to him when he entered the Springlock suit and ultimately got crushed. The game in which I want to discuss in this video is that of Five Nights at Freddy's 4, a game of which builds upon the previous in some ways but mostly branches off entirely from what we're used to in search of one thing, stimulating fear in the player. This game is different, even more so than the previous was, and watching the interview between Scott Cawthon and Dorco, this game was sparked through one thing. See, when FNAF 3 had released, one of the many things people were dissatisfied with was that of the jump scares, and how they weren't really that scary. Dissatisfied to leave this series on such a dampened note, Scott Cawthon began working on this game with the goal of making the game more scarier, and it shows. On April 27th of 2015, teaser images would begin to make their way onto his website, advertising itself as the final chapter, hinting at a Halloween release date. And on July 13th of 2015, a trailer was released for the game. The following week, on July 21st of 2015, a demo for the game would be released for selected YouTubers, and with the full game being released just 2 days later on the 23rd of July. The game was then released for Android devices on the 25th of July, and iOS devices on the 2nd of August of that same year. On the 29th of November in 2019, ports of this game would then be released on console. As previously mentioned, this game takes a vastly different approach compared to the previous games with its gameplay, while keeping many of the staples of the series consistent with this entry, and in this video, I want to discuss what makes this game terrifying yet enjoyable to me. So with that, let's discuss Five Nights at Freddy's 4. As mentioned throughout the introduction of this video, this game takes a vastly different approach to its gameplay than the previous games. As opposed to taking place in an office at a pizzeria, this time you're playing as a child in his bedroom, needing to ward off animatronics who'll try to get in by walking in through the door, appearing on the bed or on the closet. I'll discuss this more when I get to talking about the nights more in depth, but for now I want to talk about how this game furthers its narrative approach and opts to fully tell a story, being less cryptic as to what's happening and leaning more on being as such in the greater lore of the series as a whole. As I said in my previous video, I won't really talk about lore until I get to a certain game in the franchise. 5 days before the party, we find ourselves playing as a child of whom is locked within a room by an individual of whom is yet to be revealed. As we try to leave the room, we eventually give up and are left sulking on the floor, for the plushie of whom is representative of a character also yet to be revealed, telling us that tomorrow is another day. With that, we begin night 1. As mentioned earlier, this game sees you needing to check the 2 doors to your left and right, the closet in front of you and the bed which is behind you. This game sees the return of the previous 4 animatronics in the first game, alongside a few others of which will be revealed later in the game. As of right now, we need to deal with Nightmare Chica, Nightmare Bonnie, Nightmare Foxy, and finally Nightmare Freddy. In order to ward them off, we need to check the doors and shine our flashlight into the hallway. Should you hear breathing when going to check, you need to close it as it represents that either Bonnie or Chica are at your door, and listen for the footsteps signifying that they've walked away. After that, it's safe to open your door and flash your light. Freddy works a bit differently. During the nights, you'll need to check the bed behind you routinely to ward off what is known as the Freddles, in which, should you allow for them to linger at your bedside, they will eventually materialize into Nightmare Freddy and result in your jump scare. Foxy works a bit more differently, and I'll discuss that later when it's more relevant to the game. For now, night 1 should be fairly easy, and with that, we complete and cut to 4 days before the party. You get more access to the house and are told that someone is hiding again. You won't stop until you find him, and with that, you're left to roam the house. While you get hints at where to go, you can explore what appears to be a girl's bedroom and the living room, of which is where you'll be jump scared by an individual wearing a Foxy mask. Once again, left weeping on the floor, you're told once again that tomorrow is another day. After these story sections of the game, you'll enter these fun with plush trap mini games, of which sees you needing to listen out for audio cues signifying that plush trap is moving. Keep in mind he won't move whenever you're flashing your light. The goal is to let him linger and move closer to you and eventually shine your flashlight to stop him at the X mark which is right in front of you. If you succeed in doing so, you get a 2-hour head start on the next night, beginning at 2 AM as opposed to 12. Should you fail to stop him at the X mark, you'll be jump scared, and if the timer runs out, you're forced into the next night, starting at 12 AM as usual. One of the many things I want to talk about is how I really like this game's ability to keep things interesting yet distinct from the other games. I really like this game's emphasis on auditory cues which make it all the more terrifying as you need to confront the unknown behind the door and risk being jump scared. Maybe the shock of such a thing and what lies beneath could kick in much later in the game for the 5th night for some, but when I played this game for the first time, I genuinely did feel uneasy going up to the door and shining my light. Where in the previous games you had doors, masks, and audio to protect yourself from whatever threat may be lurking towards you, in this game game, you have none of that. Instead, you're forced to go right in front of whatever may be in front of you and confront it head on. You're forced to be there, with nothing but your door and darkness between you and whatever threat stands breathing down you on the other side. While of course I'm not on my first playthrough anymore, so this feeling wouldn't necessarily impact me as I've grown accustomed to this game. I can recall feeling really afraid of this game during my first playthrough, yet it's one that is so fun to play through to the point where I kept dragging myself to play time and time again. With that, after completing the night, we cut to 3 days before the party. We've been left behind by someone, of whom knew of our discomfort for being in what seems to be a pizzeria of sorts. Seeing as how we're right beside the exit, we may be able to get out if we're fast enough. With that, we're to traverse through this area in search of help. If you backtrack towards this area, you can see a certain purple guy fitting an employee into a springlock suit. Though with that aside, we struggle to muster the courage to continue onward, and lay on the ground, weeping once again. Tomorrow is another day. One of the many negative aspects of this game that I want to talk about is that of the loading times. As opposed to the previous games which loaded and played smoothly, and only briefly did so at the beginning of the night, this game is filled with loading screens. First, you need to load into the night, and when playing through it, you then need to wait for longer when checking the doors, the closet, and behind you, as the game loads each one in only whenever you go near it. Of course, this only happens at the beginning of the night, but it completely hinders gameplay and disrupts any patterns you may try to get into, develop, and practice for later. Furthermore, in later nights where animatronics will begin to move instantaneously from the moment it begins, you're essentially risking death for something that isn't even your fault. The game only seems to load things such as jump scares in the many areas of the room only when you activate the prompt for such a thing, which is never a good idea. You want to feel like you're a part of the world, not the world itself. It momentarily breaks any sort of immersion you may feel when it comes to trying to understand the world that this game takes place in and adhere to its mechanics. A big example of this is here, when I got jump scared by Nightmare Chica and the animation played as if though it were a slideshow, and also awkwardly remained in place before the transition occurred. I've read online that this seems to be an issue that many have had with this game, and I've also tried lowering the game's resolution, which from what I could notice seemed to help the issue a bit, but I can't be sure. With that aside, after we complete the night, we cut to 2 days before the party. We're at the pizzeria again, though this time if we're quick enough, we can leave. With that, we begin to make our way to the outside areas of this game. Interacting with the individuals of whom surround the area shows us that we're playing as a character of whom is constantly bullied and ridiculed for his fear of the animatronics. When finally reaching home, we're told to be careful as we enter our room and are greeted once again by the individual bearing the Foxy mask. We find ourselves weeping on the floor once more. Tomorrow is another day. With that, we enter the 4th night. One of the animatronics I want to discuss is that of Foxy, who likewise to the previous games where he's a major threat, he works differently to the other animatronics. During the nights when you need to be listening out for Bonnie and Chica roaming the halls, you'd hear fast footsteps illuminating from one of the sides. This signifies Foxy and his presence. See, as you'd know, there are 2 halls in the game directly outside of the door, of which Foxy will run between. Every time you check the hall he happens to be at, you ward him off. However, should you refrain from doing so, you'd instead hear a door open, and when you return to the center of the room, you'd see your closet door close. This means Foxy is in the room. This means on top of having to keep an eye on Bonnie and Chica in the halls as well as the Freddles on the bed, you'll also need to be keeping an eye out for Foxy, who at that point will begin residing in the closet, of whom has a multitude of stages before he attacks you entirely. It's definitely a lot of added pressure when Foxy enters the room, as the threat of death looms over you even more whenever he does. It's the reason that in later nights where warding off the other animatronics are necessary, most would aim to try and keep him out of the room entirely by focusing on the door he runs to on top of keeping an eye on Bonnie and Chica. I personally tried to prevent him from entering for as long as possible, the less pressure the better after all, but when he does, I immediately switch to a different pattern that's more difficult to maintain than when he isn't, but still doable. I definitely came close to dying in this night because of Foxy, but alas I completed it, and after doing so, we cut to 1 day before the party. We find ourselves trapped within a parts and services room, nothing but endoskeletons and spare animatronic parts within. Frightened, we beg to be let out of the room before eventually giving up and weep once again on the floor, after of which we begin night 5. Everything you'd been doing for the past few nights in this game is all put to the side, as in this night, it's just you and Nightmare Fredbear. This night is really dependent on auditory cues more than any other in the game. This is due to the fact that here, you need to be constantly listening out for where Fredbear goes in terms of direction so that you can go to that respective door and prevent him from entering from there. The reason I say that you need to be attentive is due to the fact that most of the time, his footsteps would alternate between the 2 directions, requiring you to be patient if you want to block him off at the right door. If you hear him in one direction and begin going to that door, he may suddenly begin moving in another direction to throw you off, meaning when you check, he isn't there, but more rather the opposite hall. This is why many consider to use the strategy of waiting at the center of the room and waiting for for a few seconds after hearing his footsteps in case he moves again, in which you can successfully block him off at the correct door. At times during the night, he will begin laughing, which in most cases is indicative that he's entered the room and is either on the bed or inside the closet, in which case you would ward him off the same way you would with the Freddles and Foxy. However, sometimes what is known as the fake laugh will occur. If you hear a laugh accompanied by footsteps, it means he's trying to throw you off by making you check the bed or the closet, allowing for him to get in the room and jump scare you, or move direction to throw you off more by ruining your pattern. I personally think that the issue of loading times in this game truly becomes an issue during this night and future ones. In this case, movement from Fredbear begins instantaneously, meaning these loading times with the doors, the closet and the bed contribute to artificially throwing you off. For example, if you hear him at one door and begin to move towards it, the poor loading times often lead to him going to another door while the game was loading in the hallway you were just at, meaning you then need to go to the other hallway and do the same, where he'll then move to the next door, throwing you off even more. Whenever this would happen to me, I just ended up cycling mindlessly, traveling towards each door until I was either jump scared or caught him at the last minute, in which I could finally begin actually trying to beat the night. The loading times are an issue, in which they begin to rear their heads during the later parts of the game where every second truly counts, an example being the scenario I just described. With that aside, I really like the idea of this night being a one-on-one between you and Fredbear, as symbolically it makes sense for reasons we'll see later, and mechanically changes things up and makes things more interesting. Whether this night be easier or harder than the other nights in this game is for you to decide, but I really like the change of pace this game takes with its fifth night in adding more symbolism to it while keeping things just as interesting as before. After completing the night, we cut to 0 days before the party. We're surrounded by who's eventually revealed to be our brother and his friends, whom are ridiculing and teasing us. They decide to lift us up and take us directly to Fredbear on stage, with us pleading for them to leave us be. They pick us up and take us directly to him. As the teasing continues, we're eventually placed inside Fredbear's head and find ourselves crushed between his teeth, ending the main game of Five Nights at Freddy's 4. With that, I want to discuss the extras. After completing the main game, there's loads to do after the fact. The options menu, allowing for us to see all of the animatronics, the making of some of them, in which I actually quite liked and found interesting. I really liked that we got to see some of the more behind the scenes things with the game, and if anything it really shows how much detail and work went into bringing this game to life. We also get to see some of the jump scares, replay the fun with plush trap minigame, and also partake in nightmare mode, in which I will discuss later. There's also some things locked behind either completing the aforementioned mode that I'll briefly go over in due course. Night 6 is one of the many post-game nights in which you can play through in order to reach nightmare mode. It acts as a hybrid between the first 4 nights of the game and the 5th. When I say this, I mean that from 12 AM to 4 AM, the main 4 nightmare animatronics will attempt to attack you. However, when you eventually reach 4 AM, all 4 will despawn and instead be replaced by Nightmare Fredbear, in which you will play through warding him off until the night ends. You can also play through Nightmare mode, which is a 7th night consisting of the same, but Fredbear is replaced with Nightmare. The room is less forgiving and leaves no room for error. Furthermore, you can also play through 420 mode, which you can do after completing the 7th night by inputting the number 24 times in the extra menu. As you can see, I didn't really engage with much of the extras for this video, but I have during my own playthrough of this game. I really like this game's emphasis on horror and symbolism in its story. For example, one of the many reasons Night 5 consists of only Fredbear is due to the fact that the previous story segment saw you trapped with him in a room, meaning he is currently occupying your nightmares. Furthermore, perhaps him crushing your head is the reason he occupies the latter sections of the 6th night, as these nightmare animatronics are what you as the protagonist see in your dying moments. Five Nights at Freddy's 4 is a terrifying game. Its emphasis on that clearly shows, even though indications such as that of lights flickering seemingly alluding to how close you are to dying if you've left something unchecked, or in Night 5 meaning you're about to be jump scared, the game really did get me at times, of course referring to times where issues such as that of the game's loading times causing hindrance aren't present. One of the many issues I have with this game are exactly that. I really don't think anyone would have minded waiting a few extra seconds for the game to load things such as that of jump scares and other assets rather than doing so only when you activate the prompt. I would have much preferred being able to play the game smoothly and not have issues that stem from faults other than the way I'm playing the game cause difficulties. In previous games, whenever I got jump scared, it's because I knew I did something wrong to cause it. But in this game where animatronics are moving right when the night begins, I don't feel like me dying in the early games is my fault, especially when my patterns are ruined because of the loading times. With that though, I want to conclude things. Overall, I really like Five Nights at Freddy's 4. I think that it's a brilliant game that really brings the horror factor back into the series while evolving it to make something equally as interesting and distinct, setting itself apart from the rest of the games while keeping what makes it among them, the gameplay. While as different as it is, it still feels like I'm playing a Five Nights at Freddy's game. It's rich in gameplay, fully engaging me into the world it presents while telling a tragic story that gives a more clearer narrative into what's going on throughout the beginning, middle, and end, but still remaining cryptic to how it contributes to the rest of the series. While issues such as that of the port loading times and the way they were handled really begin to rear their heads much later into the game, earlier if you're that unfortunate, it's still an enjoyable game, and I really like it, flaws and all. I would recommend this game. It's an amazing game that seeks to make things more scarier again. It's distinct and different from the rest of the series, but still representative of what makes Five Nights at Freddy's such an enjoyable series of games to play through. So, there's the video. I hope you all enjoyed it. I want to apologize for the long wait regarding this video. I know I did say in my previous that more will be coming soon, and I have been working on a lot of videos that I hope to bring to you soon. My only hope is that you enjoy what I have to offer when that time comes. If you want to follow me, then my socials would be linked in the description, as well as any afterthoughts or messages I may want to add. With that, I haven't really got much else I want to say, so I'll see you all in my next video. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I wish you all a very pleasant evening.